what I want to emphasize tonight is that at Olin, we're concerned not just with the abstract concept of mindset. What we want to do at Olin is somehow connect that in a real way to the learning experience and in a real way to learning outcomes. So here's the roadmap for the talk. What's a mindset? Why we might choose to care about this mindset concept. A couple examples, and if we have time, I'm not sure we'll have time, but step you through a few things that we've learned about mindsets at Olin. So first of all, what's a mindset? This is a prototype definition. This is my definition. I wrote this a couple nights ago, and I keep looking at it thinking, yeah, it's all right. Probably needs some editing. So mindset, a belief or mental model that shapes one's interpretation of situations and settings, and that triggers specific cognitive, behavioral, and motivational responses. What do you think? A lot of stuff there. So what we're concerned about at Olin is specifically positive learning mindsets or learner mindsets. So I added a couple words here. So interpretation of learning situations and settings. That's what we're designing at Olin. And triggering not just any cognitive and behavioral and motivational response, but a positive behavioral, cognitive, and motivational response. So that's my tweak on my own definition. So I'm already editing. You might have heard of Carol Dweck's work. She has done some amazing work in kind of getting this idea of mindset to the masses. And she talks about fixed mindset and growth mindset. So I'm going to walk through this as an example. So how many of you have heard of this? Fixed and growth mindset. Okay, so I don't have to spend much time on this. Fixed mindset examples, you're either good at math or you're not. Some smart people will always do well. Stupid people are always going to be stupid. Nothing you can do about that. Some will get it and some can't. Compare that to a growth mindset. I can learn anything I want to learn. I learn through failure. My effort and attitude translate to outcomes. It's not the only way to think about mindsets. It's not the only work that's been done in mindset. So in teacher training in particular, there are some researchers that do work in what are some positive learning beliefs that teachers might hold and then what that students might adopt. So here's some example of what's sometimes referred to as conceptions of learning or beliefs about learning. You'll see that the number one thing on the list is Carol Dweck's idea, this fixed versus dynamic or growth mindset. Same thing we just talked about. External versus internal regulation. This is basically your belief about whether or not control should come from outside of you or come from inside of you. And we'll talk more about that. Knowledge is reproduced versus actively constructed. This is this idea of constructivism. So do you believe that knowledge is something that someone else has and that person's going to give it to you in that form and you're going to take it and have it in that form? Or is knowledge something that we're all putting together piece by piece and it looks a little differently from one person to another? Individual versus social learning. So is learning best in isolation or is learning best in a collaborative, team-based, interactive type of environment? And then the last one, tolerance versus intolerance of uncertainty or ambiguity or open-endedness. So I highlighted what is generally thought of as the positive end of these continua or spectra. You'll also find a lot of work in mindsets in the adult learning, lifelong learning, self-regulated learning, self-directed learning literature. And you'll see words like this popping up. So curious people, motivated people, flexible and persistent and divergent thinking and interpersonally competent. So a whole bunch of words you'll find that you could, I think in one way or another, think about as a mindset in the lifelong learning or adult learning or self-directed learning literature. So this gives you a sense of what we're talking about when we use this word mindset. Why do we want to care about this? First, let's be clear. We don't care right now. And when I say we, I'm talking about the educational community at large. Support for that argument, you might ask me to provide a little bit of that. I can do that. Let's talk about ABET. So ABET went through a branding recently, which kind of made me laugh. Their catchphrase now is, or tagline is, be confident. I laugh because this is telling you how to be, like how to think about yourself. And then confidence is typically framed as a motivational construct. So it turns out that ABET doesn't concern itself with being, and it doesn't concern itself with motivational stuff. So I found it kind of interesting that became their tagline. But to put a finer point on it, ABET and its engineering criteria in 2000 proposed this, and actually more than proposed, required all engineering programs to show that their students have a recognition of the need for and ability to engage in lifelong learning. Sounds great, right? We can go back to that list of lifelong learner mindsets and start working on that, which is exactly what a bunch of us did in engineering education about 10 years ago in response to this, this big change in ABET. Lots of work was done. It turns out that engineering educators are really leading in many ways in what it means to take ideas of lifelong learning and self-directed learning and put them into practice in the classroom and then measure the response. So there's good work being done, but, and lifelong learning done in other fields includes this idea of beliefs or mindsets in addition to motivation and emotional development, cognitive development, behavioral development, and development in the way that you interact with your context and with other people. So there's a real opportunity here to do some good work in developing this idea of lifelong learning with regard to mindset and beyond. But ABET decided to kill that. Actually, they haven't decided yet. They're in the process of trying to eliminate this beautiful picture of lifelong learning and replace it with knowledge acquisition throughout one's life. So kind of a lower level cognitive, maybe mid-level cognitive definition of lifelong learning. Makes me really sad. We don't care. If you look at these calls for change in STEM learning, you'll oftentimes see some really great ideas around conceptual understanding, interdisciplinary thinking, a lot of ways to connect course content and concepts, but very rarely do you see calls for shifts towards mindset, emotional and social development, motivational development. Just doesn't really appear much. Next Generation Science Centers, this is using K-12, really positive moves from low-level cognition to high-level cognition, some more sophisticated thinking, but no move into motivation, social development, behavioral development, psychomotor development, a little bit of psychomotor in there, but really nothing about mindset. Here's, I think, where we find the best stuff. Engineer 2020 vision. You'll find words like ingenuity, creativity, resilience, flexibility, ethical decision-making, and lifelong learning in there. So great. There's a little bit of stuff missing around personal development in here. It's kind of more oriented towards professional development. But it's okay. It's actually pointing in the right direction. And some people are doing some stuff with this, but I'd say it's, the work is still kind of in its early stages. So hopefully this sticks and it stays and people keep working with NAE stuff. In my research group, so I have a research group that does work on emotional and social development, motivational development, lifelong learning. We like to say we're kind of in a tough spot because people aren't designing for this stuff right now. We design learning experiences based on what matters to us or to someone else, maybe a accrediting agency. And then how that gets defined ends up getting measured and gets managed. And measuring and management involves lots of money, and people put a bunch of resources, infrastructure behind certain things, and it's kind of hard to steer that boat over to other things. So we're not quite sure how to go about doing that, other than to try to convince the world that this stuff matters and it connects to all the other things that we care about. So why would we choose to care? So it turns out that in learning situations, mindsets connect to learning outcomes. Big surprise? This is not really an aha moment for you, I can tell. It's not quite that simple, though, and this is where I think it gets a little more interesting, and this is where it takes a little more thinking and a little more development work. So learner mindsets, the thinking, the beliefs, the mental models that people have get put to work in a learning situation or a climate. We'll say a classroom, or maybe a homework setting, or maybe a work setting, some learning environment. That triggers a response from people. So every time a student walks into my classroom, she looks around and tries to make sense of what's happening based on written materials, based on interactions, based on the physical layout, based on the requirements and the grading policy, all the things that I say and do and other people say and do, and draws on previous experiences and her understanding of engineering or her understanding of material science or sustainability or whatever it is I'm teaching. All that stuff goes into some thinking about, and basically weighing whether or not that environment is going to address her needs, how it aligns with her goals, and what she might want to do with it. That gets translated into actions, behaviors, strategies. If I hand out, for example, a policy on grading that points students towards certain behavioral patterns, they'll have to make a choice. They either adopt that or they do something else and weigh the repercussions of that. But not just with grading, with things like motivation, things like emotional climate of the classroom, and expected behaviors with other people. And then that, of course, then translates or informs or influences the learning outcomes. So this is the picture that we're more concerned with at Olin College. Not just saying, we want this mindset, we think it's going to map to that outcome, we'll give it a shot. No. We actually do tons of work in this middle area, and that's what I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about today. I drew this as a linear kind of step-by-step cause and effect thing. Reality is it's maybe a cycle, or more likely just a tangled mess of stuff. Psychologists like to draw it out this way. This is the picture you tend to find in educational psychology. And then, of course, this whole thing is influenced by other experiences that lead up to it, and it influences the stuff that comes after it. Okay, so I'll pause here for a moment and let you think about this. If mindset matters to learning experience and outcomes, and if mindset can be shifted, if we assume this, that mindset can be shifted and developed, and if Olin College aspires to create powerful learning experiences, how does mindset fit into what we do at Olin? And what's our role? And I ask this kind of at two levels. What's our role in developing mindsets, both in terms of the learning experiences we create for our students, but also kind of at a higher level, what's our role in the broader community in understanding mindsets and helping others understand what we do with this big abstract concept of learner mindsets. So those are the two things on my mind. So what's it mean for our students and their development? What's it mean for the engineering community and its learning? Good? Okay. Couple levers for change that I see. One is we create this every day in every classroom design that we do. We can change the conditions here, no problem. We can decide whether or not we want to create a learning environment that looks like this or like this, and we can figure out what that means for the response and for the actions and for the outcomes. So lever for change there. We can also redefine that stuff at the end, right? We can say, that list of goals that we had 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 years ago, we need to change that. Or we might care to change that. So we can use this as a lever for change. Say, the learning outcomes that we care about are these things over here, not these things that we used to talk about. So what does Olin do? Well, we talk about things like interdisciplinary thinking, creativity and design, empathy and social responsibility. These came directly out of Rick's white paper, in case you were wondering. Global awareness, teaming, collaboration, entrepreneurial thinking, ethical decision-making, self-directed learning, and intrinsic motivation. We don't just talk about these, we actually design based on these, and we help other faculty design based on these. So Rob Martello and I, with some help of other faculty many, many years ago, started developing this way of thinking about course design from the start using a different set of goals. So instead of starting with thermodynamics content, think about what you're really trying to do with your students. And it looks, like that previous list, actually. So that's the second lever for change. And third is, and this is kind of where it gets a little more researchy, I guess. We can actually understand these processes in a way that I think isn't well understood right now by the educational community. So we do more active learning and project-based learning and design-based learning at the undergraduate level than just about any other place. We have a real opportunity at Olin to do some research work in this area and to deploy prototypes in that middle space and see what happens. Okay, a couple examples that I'm going to step through. I'm going to talk about, and this is, we'll see what you do with this. I'm going to throw out some questions about this stuff that may be provocative. It's kind of intended to be. But really it's kind of getting at, we don't know everything about this mindset thing yet. So I'm going to talk about one thing that I know a lot about, internal drive. And I'm going to talk about this other thing that's come up recently and is very popular, very hot in education right now, this concept of grit as a mindset. Let's start with internal drive. So internal drive, what is it? Well, we don't have to start from scratch because it turns out there's about 100 years worth of literature, research, theory, practice that informs how we think about internal drive. I'm going to go through every one of these and spend, I don't know, maybe 20, 25 minutes on each. And then if you're still awake, we'll get some coffee in the morning and move on to grit. Actually, maybe grits in the morning? I don't know. I'm not going to do that. I just wanted to put this up here, and I don't even expect you to read it. I just expect you to say, wow, there's a lot of stuff with regard to internal drive that we can draw on, and we do. So I'm going to highlight a couple of things. Mindsets. I mentioned this already, conceptions of learning. There's this idea that you can view learning as being something that should be externally controlled or internally controlled. Externally driven, internally driven. What does it mean for internal regulation? Well, I just pulled these right off of a measurement tool. Learning will be more successful if students themselves take the initiative. Students lose their motivation in school if everything is presented in a pre-digested way. Basically, students are perfectly capable of working on their own, and students achieve better results when they have freedom in how they work. So you can see the words that I highlighted: initiative, motivation, working on their own. So I coupled that to kind of strategy, choice, and then freedom or autonomy in what they do. Gives you a sense of what people mean when they say internal regulation beliefs. 2, I mentioned this already, we design this. So in my class, I create project-based learning environments where students actually have to do this stuff on the previous list. They have to make choices, they have to choose strategies, they have to take initiative, and if they don't, they're punished by grades. Just kidding. No, it's actually, so that's kind of where it gets tough, right? Like if you open up an environment and say, autonomy supportive, and students have a mindset that is maybe not quite aligned with that, what do you do? A lot of learning to be done, I think, with figuring that out. In this middle section, what Rob Martello and I and a bunch of colleagues at Zhinya Zestavker at Olin and a bunch of colleagues at other schools do is we actually pick measurements that fall into this middle space. So instead of just measuring learning outcomes, we measure things like how are students actually processing what's going on in class, and what are they choosing in terms of motivation or behavioral strategies. And there's some theory that informs this. So how many of you have seen Dan Pink's book, Drive? How many of you have seen the one that preceded it by Edward Deci? He was our convocation speaker last year. Yeah, so this is a theory called self-determination theory that describes different types of motivations. You may have seen something like this before. This theory says people can adopt motivational attitudes and behaviors that are more controlled or more autonomous or internalized. So a motivation is when students say, don't know, don't care, I don't know what this is about, I don't really care. What I do won't matter, no connection between action and outcomes, I'm just going through the motions. External regulation, carrots and sticks, punishments and rewards, I have to do it, no choice, or I really want that prize, or I really want to win the competition. These are called controlled motivations, external. On the other end, we have more positive stuff. This is useful, or it's important, or it's valuable to me. That's called identified regulation. Or the best form of motivation, the most positive, is fully internalized, doing things for the sake of passion, joy, or internalized interest. And that's intrinsic motivation. These are called either internalized or autonomous motivations. You can actually measure this stuff, and there's tons of stuff out there, measurement tools, depending on what you're interested in measuring. These are some that we've used at Olin and at other places. This one I like, situational motivation scale. Ask people why they're doing what they're doing in a class. You're engaged, why are you engaged? And there could be lots of reasons for that. And it turns out that different classroom conditions will support different types of motivation. So what do we want to get that internalized drive or that intrinsic motivation? 3 things. Students need to feel that they're gaining a sense of competence. They need to feel a sense of relatedness, and they need to feel a sense of autonomy. Just very quickly going through those. Competence is a sense that you're getting better, that you can be successful, that you can master what you're doing. If you see that one of your designs is working, this is design nature, you might have a better chance of getting a sense of competence than if what you're doing is invisible to you. Relatedness. Connection to other people at any level, within the team, within society, within your discipline. Team-based work really helps with this. This is a picture from a 3-college course in sustainability. This is a picture at the end of Design Nature, engaging with 4th graders from the local community, team of Olin students. So lots of opportunities for relatedness there. Autonomy, sense of freedom and control. Start of user-oriented collaborative design course. We don't tell students what they're going to design for. We ask them, what are you interested in doing? Oh, wait, we have people in the audience who are also in this picture. Yes. We ask students, who do you think is worth spending some time designing with or designing for? And then they come up with a list. We do some processing, and they're working with people that they think are valuable to work with. Or various technical projects where there's a lot of choice in the kind of measurements that they're doing or how they're sending things out into the real world. This is a weather balloon with a bunch of sensors. And then we can talk about goals differently. I mentioned this already, and we can draw on theory for that to help us figure out what that looks like in a class. Rob and I and others at Olin do a lot of competency-based assessment, which means we create courses around these goals, as I mentioned, and then we measure based on these goals. There are also tools that other people develop that will get at students' use of, for example, certain cognitive and metacognitive strategies, certain behavioral strategies, or certain social strategies in a learning environment. We use these things too. Does it matter? Does it matter if students adopt internal drive as opposed to external drive? Yes. It does matter. It turns out that internal versus external correlates or even causes desirable or undesirable outcomes. If you care about high-level cognition, things like creation and evaluation and synthesis, you might want to start thinking about internalized drive. The two are intimately connected. So much so that we did some modeling of some data from a set of courses at Olin. And we basically showed that if you tell me about students' emotional orientation, I can tell you with reasonable accuracy the extent to which they're engaging in things like critical thinking or elaboration or metacognition. It's kind of interesting, I think. Creativity. Might want to think about internalized drive if you care about creativity. Creativity in all fields flourishes under intrinsic motivation, the drive to do something because it's interesting, involving, exciting, satisfying, or personally challenging. This is Teresa Amabile. She did some groundbreaking work in creativity back in the 80s and 90s that we're still using today. She actually includes intrinsic motivation, a form of internalized drive, as a core component of her conceptualization of creativity. You don't get creativity without it, basically. We kind of covered this already. If you care about self-directed and lifelong learning, you can't also say you want your students to be extrinsically or externally driven to be self-directed and lifelong learners. Two don't go together. Engagement and persistence tied to internalized drive. What we find at Olin is that if you can track short-term interactions and get a read about what we call situational motivational responses, whether or not you have internal or external drive, you can see that playing into how they think about things like their discipline and their program and their major and their career. And that's what some of the things that my research team is doing right now. And then positive emotions, not surprising. Intrinsic motivation is defined with words like joy and passion. It's not surprising that it connects to positive emotions. So here's the summary of that. Internal drive maps to all these things, and I would say it maps to them through student-centered experience design, which is what we really focus on at Olin. So we identify the things we want here, and we do the work in the middle to actually make it a reality and understand what's going on. So that's kind of the internalized drive start to finish. Should I go through grit now? How are we doing on time? Okay, we'll get through grit. I'm going to skip all the stuff about what we've learned at Olin. We could talk about that over dinner. Okay, let's talk about grit. So this is, again, very hot topic in education. Everyone's talking about it at every level of education. Grit, what is it? Oh, Duckworth, Angela Duckworth. Look up her TED Talk and watch it. Think about it. It's a pretty interesting idea. Power of passion and perseverance in learning. So grit is defined this way. Grit equals trait level perseverance and consistency of interest. Trait level perseverance is actually defined with a, do you know about personality trait theory, the big five you've heard about, like extroversion, introversion, openness to experience, neuroticism, which I'm kind of high in, unfortunately, conscientiousness. So this is actually, comes from trait personality and says, these are basically fixed traits that they're expressed within a certain range, but kind of you are who you are. So conscientiousness is part of this grit. And then consistency of interest. Basically, do you stick with things that you say you're going to stick with in the long term? So here are some of the items on the grit scale. Trait level perseverance, I finish whatever I begin. I'm a hard worker, I'm diligent. Good stuff, right? We want that in our students. On the other side, consistency of interest. I often set a goal but later choose to pursue a different one. New ideas and projects often distract me from previous ones. My interests change from year to year. These are all reverse scored, so if you say yes to these, you get a low consistency of interest. That's kind of obvious, I think. And then those are added up to give the grit scale. It's pretty interesting, I think. It's definitely mapping mindsets to some outcomes, those outcomes being persistence in a task, finishing what you started. So we have this mapping. If you look at the research on grit, you'll find some really positive connections between grit and things like performance. This is academic performance, things like GPA and finishing programs, persistence in programs, and persistence in hobbies and other activities over time. Self-regulation can go either way, either not correlated or positively. That's great. High-level cognition, same thing, either not correlated or positive. Deep learning, not so much, which basically means some people with grit adopt surface level and some people with grit adopt deep learning strategies. Positive emotions are all over the map in the literature. Creativity is pretty consistently negatively correlated with grit. And then pro-social, like collaboration and teaming and engaging with others in a positive way, I couldn't find it. So it hasn't been tested yet. So there's a lot of question marks around grit. I think at Olin, we have a responsibility. We think about ourselves as pioneers in learning experience design. I think it's our job to explore this stuff and to find out what it means for us and what it might mean for the engineering educational community. So big questions I have about grit, and I'll finish with this, and these maybe you can discuss over dinner if you like. What are my big questions about grit? Number one, it's kind of defined here and here, but there's not a lot of work in the middle. Can we develop this in a way that will increase or help us design learning experiences? What does that look like if we take these big concepts here and here and plop them down in the middle? How do we design courses around it? I think we should try. Could grit benefit from a new problem framing? This is one of my beefs with grit is when you hear people talk about it, they say, we've got these school systems and the problem is students aren't persisting through them. They don't have grit. So we need grittier people in our school systems. Not crazy about that framing. Actually, I'm not, I've become wary of any effort in educational change that attributes problems in our educational system to students. And that's what it feels like this is kind of doing. I know it's not intending to do that, but I say we can reframe this and say, what does grit look like in the classroom? And do we need to think about the interaction of grit in classroom? What does it look like at the institutional learning culture level? What do our disciplines say about grit? And what are our cultural or societal values around this? I think if we kind of reframe the problem as a what does grit look like in a classroom situation, we might be better off. Does the grit concept sidestep bigger questions? So Alexandra Coso and I are teaching a new course in the spring called Educational Design Studio. This is a version of one of the posters that we used. If you are not questioning the system that exists and you're just saying we need a different set of student behaviors and mindsets, I think you're missing some of the biggest questions in educational change right now. What we do at Olin is we question the system. So if we consider, this is from a Sir Ken Robinson animated TED Talk, if we consider our educational system right now, especially in K-12, industrial system, standardized testing, dividing things up by discipline, and we ask questions around grit, should we not be asking questions around the design of the system simultaneously? So that's kind of what I'm getting at with that. So why is it designed this way? How might we design it differently? What does it have to do with internalized drive and grit? So generally, I say we need to redefine grit as Olin College and get away from this idea of just saying we need grit, period. Like persist in this thing that we've created for you, and then we'll say you're gritty and that's good. And we need to shift to something that I might call strategic grit, or reflective grit, or self-determined grit. I think we could do this. So I'm going to end with this. Olin has an opportunity here. We can question this stuff, mindsets. We can explore it. We can design for it or based on it. We can share it with a community. And I think we can ultimately lead in this area. No one's taking the lead as an institution right now in the big abstract idea of mindsets. No one is mapping it in the way that I just described to the classroom experience and outcomes. I think we can, and maybe we should do that. And I think I'll leave you with that. And we can talk later about what we're doing in our research at Olin. So thank you all for